afternoon, everybody. How you all doing today?
Hello.
Hey.
Fantastic.
Getting all the little bells and whistles set up over here, making sure that we're good to go. Do a refresh, make sure I'm paused over there. Yay. And we are live. And I got a little bit of an echo in the background. There we go. Des, you want to kick us off?
I am. I was in the middle of typing and sharing to my audience because my audience wants to hear everything you guys have to say because they're bored of me. So I needed to make sure to spend that extra time. So hello, audience who is now viewing in. We're going to be having a fantastic day. And of course, I want to start this off with Ryan. Ryan, why wouldn't the shrimp share its treasure?
It's shellfish.
Yeah, it's a little shellfish.
A little shellfish, just a wee bit shellfish.
I may have heard that one before.
I got a whole calendar of them. Thank you, everyone who's slowly tuning in. We will promise we're going to get kicked off in a couple minutes here. We're just going to spend a couple of seconds here kind of chit-chatting. We would love for you to chit-chat in the comments and the views there. Welcome to joining us. If you want to actually forfeit all of the compliance conversation and you just want to do bad dad jokes, you can put that in there now, and that way we don't have to actually talk about anything work. Also fantastic. Love all those things. I feel like there's a whole world of people who do not want me to continue or do expand on the bad dad jokes. So we'll be getting started in just a couple minutes here. We're going to be covering a ton of information. I'm really excited. This is our second event that we've been doing. If this is your first time watching us, really exciting. We are going to be really focusing on compliance. We're not really going to be necessarily focusing on why you have to buy a compliance scorecard today, but you do. But this isn't the conversation. We're going to be having a conversation about how do we even take compliance out of the conversation? How do we make this a risk management conversation? How do we help you as a managed service provider or an IT service provider or whatever acronym you want to live in with it and help your clients with their compliance and their risk management conversation? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to today's presentation, Developing Effective Policies and Standard Operating Procedures. Great conversation today we are going to have. And with that, I will introduce myself first, I guess would probably be a good thing. My name is Desiree Thomas. If you have not met me before, please connect with me on LinkedIn, social, Facebook, wherever you're at. If you want to actually see me in person, I will be at CCF next month. I'm very excited. If you're not attending CCF, definitely take a look. It is in Chicago. It's going to be a great event. It's one of my very favorite events. There's no booth time. So it's all about networking, communication, and building those relationships. So highly recommend. If you want to see me in real life, I will be there. And then my teammates, my wonderful teammates, I'm going to go round robin and let you guys introduce yourself. First, I will do Mr. Brian Blakely, who has taught me that compliance can be made simple.
Thanks, Des. Hey, everybody. Glad that you're here. Excited to share a little bit about this topic. Hopefully it's of use. And I'm the old guy on the panel probably here. Came up in the 90s in the engineering ranks. That's right, punch cards that I used in college in the data processing department is how documents were done for homework. But then got bit by that entrepreneurial bug in 1999, built, grown, sold, exited several IT managed service businesses, a couple of compliance readiness and fractional CISO businesses, and I lead the professional services division here at Compliance Scorecard. So real excited to be here and learn from the other panelists and hopefully provide some nuggets that are useful.
And then with that, Ryan, would you please take a second to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everybody, Ryan Seymour here, Connect Secure, VP Consulting Education. Started my career early in the 2000s in Southeast Michigan, where I'm from. Worked with lots of MSPs over the last couple decades here. Spent about 10 years at ConnectWise as a consultant. Spent another 6 years running a MSP consulting business, which was eventually acquired by Connect Secure. And I am now on the Connect Secure team, leading the charge for bringing vulnerability and compliance management to all of our MSP partners out there. And really excited to be here with you guys and share some of the tips, tricks, and wisdom that we've learned along this way. So Really happy to be here representing ConnectSecure, and like Brian said, learning from the panel, learning from our partners, and this is all a really great community. So happy to be here representing ConnectSecure.
And then Mr. Tim Golden, the one who taught us all that apparently compliance is a conversation we should be having. Please introduce yourself.
Hey, thanks, Des. Yeah, Tim Golden, founder and CEO of Compliance Scorecard, where we help you have the risk conversation with your customer using our compliance scorecards. Always excited to be here and help educate and bring thoughtful and actionable discussions to the MSP community. Today, one of my favorite topics, policies, procedures, standards, documentation, says the highly dyslexic guy that spent the last 30 plus years writing. So yes, we may have really good policies and procedures, but I can't guarantee you they're all spelled correctly. Thankfully, we have really smart people like Brian, Des, and everybody else on our team that checks my homework. Excited to be here today. Thank you so much.
So awesome. I'm going to head it right off to you guys one at a time, because we're talking about policies, standard operating procedures. We're talking about standards across the board. So as an example, Post-its, those are the right way for password management, right? That's the policy that we have, right? That's right, a good policy. So Tim, I'll bring you right across the board, because I know that my password manager here is the good one, but what is your baseline for, what do you recommend? How do you define a policy, a standard procedures, or any of those fun things?
Yeah, when I first got into policy writing, again, I'm going to go back to the highly dyslexic and can't spell, because it was really interesting, because I worked for an educational research company. And when we ended up having to build out all the documentation, we did a lot of the things, but none of it was written down. And I had to learn how to, spell a little better and deal with that, and basically spent every day of my life, the better part of 6 months to a year, understanding the thing and then writing to the thing, and making sure, even more importantly, that we actually did the thing that we said we were writing, right? That alignment phase that I always kind of like to bring up. If I think of standards, policies, and procedures, standards tell us the what, the policies tell us the why, and the procedures tell us the how. I think that's the simplest way that I can kind of define it.
Brian, I'm hoping that you're going to say all the things I'm thinking, because all I can think of is everything that you've taught me in the last little bit.
Yeah, I think, the way Tim framed it, he framed it well, right? When I think about policies, what comes to mind is rules of the road, right? You've got a little bit of the why there for sure, and a little bit of the what. The why is what we really focus on in policies, because that reflects the tolerance of risk of the organization. So that's one of the most important things about policy development, because you can't go into a company or an MSP, to Tim's point, and have draconian 58-page policies that the organization could never even begin to resource or operationalize. Right. So policies are really why, a little bit of the what. Standards are what exactly, right? All customer PII must be encrypted at rest at AES 256 and in transit at TLS 1.2 plus, right? That's a standard. Standards, remember, people get standards and guidelines confused in policies sometimes. Standards are non-negotiable. If you have a standard in a policy, you do that. Right? It's not a suggestion. It's not something you aspire to do. You're doing it. Okay. And you also have controls that support it. Okay. So again, policies really are a heavy why, a little bit of what. Standards are what exactly. So standards are what exactly. And then procedures are really, how does the rubber meet the road? What are the people doing it? Who's doing it? How are they doing it? And we'll talk a little bit more about how to get to Goldilocks with procedures, right? Because a lot of MSPs out there, when we look at procedures, they're commingled with the policy. That's a big no-no, right? We want to separate. Policies stand the test of time. They're higher level. Procedures may change more frequently, right? Proper nouns change, tools change, technology moves, et cetera. So procedures really get into the how and the who and at what frequency. So excited to kind of talk through that a little bit more today. And then really interested, Ryan, what's your take on policy standards and SOPs?
Yeah, I think you gentlemen framed it up really nicely. I'm always trying to take what is a complex question and use the fewest words possible, which kind of forces us to be concise and precise on what we're saying. So for me, policy is what sets intent, right? Policy sets what is the intention for me when I think of a policy. That's what are we trying to accomplish? That's what the policy should outline, the intent. The standard is that measurable, that is non-negotiable, and that ensures that there's a consistency that's delivered in that policy. So I feel like the standard really defines those measurable requirements that are definitive and we don't deviate from them, that define consistency and compliance in many cases. And then the SOP is what really turns all of that into action. The SOP tells us how we're going to actually deliver those policies and standards, right? Those are the steps that we're going to take to actually deliver it. So for me, policy sets your intent, your standards define those measurables, and then the SOP actually operationalizes those things and shows you how to actually have a checklist and go through the 1, 2, 3. Okay, I did those things that we said. So that's my layman's terms for that.
Wow. And just real quick to put an exclamation point on something Ryan said around intent. So important that there's management or leadership intent with each policy, because later on, people are going to have to spend money, right, on resources to operationalize or put into motion the controls that support the why and the policy. And it's great to have a sentence that's written in business terms or the language of business in each policy. So when the stakeholders have to write a check, they remember what business problem you're solving. That's what leadership and intent in a policy is. It sets that stage. If we're talking about vulnerability scanning, a leadership intent for the vulnerability and patch management policy is we want to scan and understand what our weaknesses or flaws are in our systems and have a plan to remediate them. Almost any business stakeholder can understand that, right? And then so I just wanted to kind of emphasize that, Ryan. That was a great point on leadership and management intent.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely love the intent pull out as well. When you talk about from a staffing perspective of an employee, there's a lot of times that the boss people say you should do these things, and I'll be like, but why? Why is the reason? And I'm not necessarily going to do them, because if no one gives me a why, then I don't see the value. Then there's no really, like, you're just giving me extra work. So I have been a part of several companies that have had bad policies and good policies. What would you define as the difference between the two?
So I'd love to answer that, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. I want to throw out there, and it ties actually into the good or bad versions or whatever of a policy. Having seen the iteration of templates and documents and things over the years, like way back in 2004, 5, 6, 7, none of this stuff existed. You couldn't Google such and such template, such and such procedure. They just didn't exist. And well, GPT didn't exist, so we couldn't GPT it either. We had to actually think about writing these and watching that iteration of just a structured document over time. I think that is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to documentation across all of IT, for that matter. There is no standard, there is no structure. Brian, you mentioned intent. Des, you mentioned the why. Having a standardized structure of purpose, scope, roles, enforcement, all of those key components of how do you actually structure a document that's consistent so that you've been on the auditor side, so that you don't piss the auditor off because he's got 15 different versions of 12 different fonts and 19 different headings and nothing is consistent, and now you've angered your auditor. You definitely don't want to do that. So where I have seen bad documentation is just something as basic as the structure. Everything is different fonts, different headings, doesn't have a standard, doesn't have, key components of what is this damn thing and what is its intent and why, document to document to document, even font color and formatting, and like just that inconsistency from document to document, at least not as an auditor side or somebody that needed to read these and push them out. That's been my pet peeve around bad documentation, is that just there's no standard, there's no structure, and that it's just awful.
Good point.
What about you, Brian? Have you seen good or bad structure, policy? What makes a good or bad document?
Yeah, mostly what I've seen is bad. Generally speaking, what happens is people play whack-a-mole. They have some sort of insurance requirement, client requirement, or something that says they've got to have an information security plan or program. They have to have policies. So what do? They go to the internet. They download a bunch of templates. They do what I call copy pasta, whatever name's in there for their company name. And they could be structured, right? You could have a whole nice 20 policies that are all structured all the same, but it's just a bunch of BS that nobody in the organization knows exists. They're shelfware. Nobody has awareness or training. There's no resources or controls or anything that support them. So they just exist, right? They've been copy pasted, and there they live on a shelf, never operationalized, there to check a box quickly. And not only that, but bad policies create risk. Okay. So the worse your policy and the more your policies say that you do a bunch of stuff you don't do, you just added a ton of exposure, liability, and risk to your organization. So if you have a bad day, or you have to call the insurance company, the cyber risk insurance company, to come save your ass, you're having a bad day, they're going to say, oh, show me your policy, show me a little bit about your program. And if you have a bunch of stuff in there you don't do, they're never going to satisfy that claim. Or if your client audits you, or you have a formal, to Tim's point, an auditor look at that, they're going to say, wow, this is a lot of words on a page, fairly robust policies, and they're well organized and structured. Show me your evidence that these controls that you have, hey, you got this 12-page asset management policy. This is fantastic. It's beautiful. Show me your evidence that shows that you have controls that support this. Can I talk to some people that are responsible for asset management to see if they even know this policy exists? So to me, the danger zone is in this copy, paste, an untailored bunch of stuff that the organization doesn't do, has no plan to do, and has no awareness that the policies exist. Extremely dangerous.
Great point, Brian. What about you, Mr. Ryan? Where have you seen good, bad, ugly, awesome, amazing, not so good documentation?
So I think I've seen a little bit of everything. We've seen some examples of good and examples of bad, and then everyone else kind of falls in the middle somewhere. For me, I guess I'll give you a little bit of both. I think the bad side of it is, vagueness in your policies and your documentation. Being too vague, being generalized, I think is something that, to Brian's point, if you're just downloading a template, doing a Control-R, find and replace, and sticking MSP name here, that generally is generalized. It's very vague. It doesn't even speak to the business processes that you're actually following. So surprisingly, I've seen a lot of that happening. I think misalignment is another big problem with the documentation, right? Is it aligned to the business needs, to the business goals, to the objectives? Not to steal your thunder, Tim, I know that's one of the A's, but that's a bad sign of a bad document when it doesn't align with the overall business strategy, right? I think on the flip side of that, documentation, starting that structure is so important. Just like framing a house or building any structure, you need to have that solid base, and it needs to be repeatable, so that if I'm looking at a document for customer A, customer B, customer C, I know how to navigate through that document because it's the same. The words may be different, of course, hopefully, but again, the structure should be recognizable so I can navigate through it and find the information we need. So I think consistency, having that template's very important, and the best documentation always has that consistent structure. Making it actionable too. I'm all about having actionable policies, right? Not just a bunch of words that say stuff, but words that define what's going to be done, right? Having an actual plan, being prepared, I think is part of that documentation structure is what makes a good document from a great document, is going beyond the why, but then how. And I think you got to have both pieces in there. And those may be different documents, but I think they need to go hand in hand. Brian, did you want to, did I
Yeah, I just want to say, I know we're talking about structure a lot, and I don't disagree, nor do I want to discount structure. But I have seen where I've got, this happened a year or so ago, got involved with a startup that dealt with some of the most sensitive PHI on the planet, right? They went to their law firm who had this, and I'll do air quotes, HIPAA packet. The HIPAA packet contained, I don't know, 300 pages of HIPAA policies and stuff, extremely well structured, very late, over lawyered, but very nice, right? You could find everything. Everything was consistent and awesome. But again, it didn't meet the organization where it was at that point in time. It was not tailored. It was not customized. It created more risk. So again, here's a well-structured and well-organized and extremely well-articulated program that was all just a myth, right? It was all just the stuff that aspirationally, even this organization couldn't even begin to operationalize or put resources behind, right? They're a 20-person startup and they have 400 pages of policies, right? It's just ridiculous. So it actually creates more risk than it helps. So I'm not discounting structure. Structure is important, especially to auditors and regulators to come in. We want to put smiles on auditors' faces. And to do that, we make their world easy and simple to be able to connect control requirements to policies that instantiate things we actually do.
Yeah. Yeah, great point, Brian. And I think my last comment I'll make, because I think it's the one that, again, I've seen some very successful organizations that do this. And for me, it's that stakeholder buy-in. I think that's one of the biggest things about the policies is having buy-in, obviously from the customer. And I know Tim's going to get into that, but I find that the companies that work with their internal staff, their internal team to build the policies, the ones that are actually going to carry out those policies, the ones that actually are responsible to deliver those policies, I think developing them with your staff is very important. I think you need to have some of those key stakeholders involved. I tend to see when there's buy-in from the staff, they tend to know why they're carrying out these things. Why am I doing this? Well, if they were part of the decision making and the strategy, they tend to find the execution a little easier.
Imperative.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. It's almost like you read my mind because I was literally going through this today. So, compliance scorecard, you'd think we'd have our own shit together. Well, sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. And, one of the areas that I personally have been struggling with is around what, Des?
Onboarding.
I know, because, we all do onboarding slightly different for every one of our customers. So, yeah. And just because I say it should be done this way doesn't necessarily mean it should be done that way. So literally what just happened today, Des, for our onboarding, like not even 15 minutes ago, now that I'm thinking about it.
You were reaching out to the team to help with the onboarding process, to get people's feedback, to help in with creating the policies and procedures for onboarding.
Yeah, exactly. It ties right into what Ryan was saying. Like, hey, CEO comes up with a policy that says this is how we do X. Go do it, team. No, like, I think I've learned that lesson over time where it's just because Tim thinks it's a good idea doesn't necessarily mean it is the right or good idea. And it's a lesson I continue to learn day after day by inviting, as Mr. Seymour said, inviting the key stakeholders and having them as part of this process so that it's not developed in a bubble. Now, I'm not always good at that, so I appreciate your grace, but 7 or 8 months ago, I didn't need to have this because the only person in the process was me. Now that we have a team that we're building that out, and the same would be true for your MSP. You know, there's a lot of MSPs that might only have 1 or 2 staff, but that tribal knowledge, right, of how things are done, why they're done that way, the stakeholders, involving your team in that process is important. And the second most important thing I will say is, as business leaders, we need to ensure that when we invite our team members into that conversation, we give them the time to do that work. Right? Just don't throw something at them and say, give this to me tomorrow. I've done that a few times. But allow them an opportunity to digest and to provide, criticism and feedback along the way, and make sure that they have the resources and time and empower them to do that work. Lessons that I've learned over the years as well. Like, hey, I need this thing like 20 minutes ago.
I want to pull something out here that Brian and I hear Brian talks about quite often, and it is one of I personally think a really powerful thing for our audience to hear. Policies, and Brian, please interrupt me and correct me at any point, but policies are giving you the opportunity as a managed service provider to say, what are the standards? And then with your SMB, to stop them every time they say no. Don Wednesday and I used to talk about the yes ladder all the time as a sales process. And where do you ask the question, where are you? And then where is the next stop? And are they saying yes or no? And what I absolutely love about when we talk about creating policies, as an example, a password management policy is the one that I talk about all the time. Do you want your staff to use password as password? If you talk to the C-suite of any business, most likely they're going to say, password should not be password. We should probably do a password manager. We should probably create a policy for that. So we're going to create a policy. But when it gets to that person that's actually spending the money, and you can put this in any place across the board, all of a sudden that person spending the money, they have 13 different policies and now another $10,000 that they have to spend. They're going to start looking at that and be like, no, we don't want to do this. We don't want to do this. We don't want to do this. But okay, if password is still, if you don't want to spend money on a password management, then you need to decide, is password okay? And how do you create that policy and how do you get to that point? And chances are when you go backwards and fact check them, they're going to realize they were created the policy for a reason to solve a problem. So they're either going to backtrack and say, now that's not important. We don't care. It doesn't matter. Or they're going to say, we have to spend the money. And I love that way to frame it for a managed service provider and their clients to be able to help with that conversation.
Awesome stuff, Des. Brian, any feedback on that?
Yeah, I think what Des said is spot on, right? Is just like Ryan shared a second ago, and we put an exclamation point on that too, as far as being imperative, getting buy-in. But when you're working on that leadership intent, and you as an MSP, and you have your points of contact and your client stakeholders on that call, and you're going through and you're talking about, okay, we're going to have a and what I usually do in this exercise when you're tailoring policies is I try to stay away from controls and requirements and standards, but I try to put it in business terms, right? So you're saying something like, do we all agree that, hey, if bad actors or bad guys are trying to get into our network, that we should be alerted and somebody should watch that alert and do something about it? Do you want to know when bad guys are in our network, right? And they'll all say, yes, we do. Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah. We've got to know when there's bad actors trying to do bad things in our network, right? Or trying to get to our data. We got to know that. Okay. That's logging and monitoring, right? And incident response. To Des's point, when you're building that and you get that leadership buy-in and you build a policy and controls to support that, later on, there's going to have to be an investment in time and resources and money and tools and that kind of thing. Right. So when you're doing that and everybody shakes their head, yes, we want to know when bad guys are trying to do bad things and trying to get to our data. You also educate a little bit to say, okay, down the road, that means that we're going to have people, process, and technology to support this. And there's going to be a spend or investment in a tool to do that. You've planted the seed, you've let them know, you've reinforced and connected. There's going to be people, process, and technology to operationalize and do and support that, hey, we want to know when bad guys are in our network trying to do bad things or trying to steal data, right? Later on, to Des's point, people get weird when wallets have to come out, right? They get a statement of work and now it's like, oh, do I really need to spend that money? What am I? And then you can pull out the policy and say, remember, we all agreed that knowing when bad actors or bad guys are trying to do bad things or get to our data, we want to know about it and be able to respond and kick them out. Well, this is the tool to do that, or this is the solution that we need to implement to do that. I might have gotten it wrong. Maybe that's not important, right? So you fall on your sword a little bit back to your client as an MSP. Hey, maybe I got the policy wrong. Maybe you're okay with bad guys trying to do bad things on your network and not knowing about it and them stealing data, right? So you're okay with that. So that's where you can kind of get that. You start to get that connective tissue, for lack of a better way of putting it, between spending money on people, process, and technology that's doing the controls and doing the procedures that support leadership's intent, which they said, we don't want bad guys to trying to do bad things and steal our data. We want to know when that happens. We're going to kick them out. So that's kind of that connecting the dots and coming to the full life cycle of instantiation. We do things, we spend money to protect our network and connect it all the way back to leadership intent.
Awesome. I love that, Brian. Mr. Seymour.
Yeah, and Brian, I think, it's important, like you said, that stakeholder buy-in at the customer level, connecting back the why over and over is very important. Why are we doing this? Remember, we talked about this, that buy-in, that conversation. I think that goes a long way when we're defining this, right? But then let's look at the inside. Let's look at our staff too. And Tim, you said this, and it's something that I was afforded during my career that is important. And I think that's leadership, or those that are in positions of power and management positions, that they are giving your staff the time they need to do these things. And I always find it, hey, if the boss says that I can take time to do this and I can actually schedule it and I've got the time at work to do this thing, then it's important. Because if you don't give them the time to do it, it kind of feels like it's not as important. So I know it's a small thing, but I always found it impactful for the companies and the leaders that I've spoken to that have always stressed to their teams, take the time that you need to do this documentation stuff. Many times this should be done before any work even gets done. I mean, it should be one of the first things that we're doing is getting our strategy in alignment with the customer's business goals, with the compliance, with all the things we said we were going to do, and giving your people the time to do that, I think, is so important through all of this, because then it really sets the stage for accountability, and that there needs to be an owner of this process. It shouldn't just get, done once and done and forget it, but there should be, planned time that these things get worked on. So I know that's a small one, but I think it's super important that all the MSP leaders and folks that are in leadership positions, that you're telling your team and you're making sure your team puts that stuff in the calendar, on the calendar, so they have time to do it, because it is that important. So I'll leave you with that.
I love that. Empower your team, give them the time, and allow them the opportunity to do the work, I think is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
So Des, you have an hour or two this week and next to look at that onboarding document that I probably totally messed up. And yes, I'm going to help empower you and give you the time and the tools to go do it.
Oh, I'm busy that day.
Oh, perfect. Well, then what about tomorrow?
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. That's absolutely fantastic. I'm going to flip into a scenario here. I don't know if you guys have ever heard anything about fires and floods and backups, tornadoes, hurricanes, all of those fun things. We know that in our industry, we worry about fires and floods, but that is not just everything. There's also things like ransomware, people doing bad things, all of the fun things that we talk about. So let's talk about a scenario where a client's insurance company requests the documentation after an incident and the incident response plan outlining the backups for their upcoming insurance renewal. Without the standard operating procedure, they might not even know where to find this information. So when have you found a good standard SOP that works, and when a good SOP that doesn't work? not being able to find it is probably one of those answers.
Oh, well, I can talk about a scenario, or at least how it ties into this a wee bit for a second. So, might not be specific to cyber insurance, but it is specific to an audit. And so, as I said, spent many years writing, thought I had all my bases covered. Auditor comes in and starts digging through. And since, as you mentioned, fires, floods, and all the other things, as we were looking at the incident response plan, the BDCR, the backup or disaster recovery plan, and I thought I had all my bases covered until I didn't. And I talk about this quite frequently. Go through the entire audit and the auditor comes back with a ding or a, unsat as part of our documentation. And that was because in this well-planned, well thought out, key stakeholder intent, all the things, I missed something. I did not write anything anywhere in any document about flooding. Well, we're in New Hampshire. It doesn't flood here. Okay, maybe we get snowstorms, but we don't flood here. So it never even dawned on me. I could see if I lived in some island that was sea level that had, torrential rains all the time, but that didn't happen here in New Hampshire. So I never even thought of it, never even came across my mind. And the auditor said, well, it isn't in the policy, but your data center is on the first floor. And what is above you? The roof, plumbing, fire systems, and so on and so on and so forth. Just because the water around you doesn't rise to flood out, that doesn't mean that all the water above you wouldn't come down and being able to flood you. So I learned oh my God, even if I thought something was never going to happen, chances are you should probably still talk about it and write about it, because you might get dinged on it like we did for not talking about flooding. So that was one instance specifically to us years ago. Of course, rewrote it all and had to deal with it. That was one instance where documentation failed. How about you, Mr. Brian? Given the insurance scenario.
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button there. But when I think about scenarios like this where documentation is called into question, oftentimes where people have created the most risk for themselves is A, they can't find it, or B, they can, and it's just they can't prove that there's things in place, controls in place, procedures in place that support the policies are real. And so the whole thing gets thrown out. And I think when I've seen success in those scenarios is where it might not be the most elegant. I think Ryan brought up something, in terms of, and I'll use my own phrase here, word density, but really having some very clear, concise, to the point procedures that you can prove are followed. Tim's point of not including, contingencies for every single bad thing that could happen is probably not, you're probably not going to be able to think of every single bad thing that could happen, but to have contingencies, let's say, hey, if this resource or, could be a people, a process, or a piece of technology is not available, whether it's the office, data, whatever that asset is that's not available, do we have a plan in place where the business knows what they're doing? That's business continuity. Disaster recovery, IT knows what they're doing to respond and get things back to normal, right? Incident response is specific to, was a security incident involved in causing the confidentiality, integrity, or availability issue, right? So Des, we're really on, really focusing left. I'm getting some notes here that I'm choppy. Am I choppy? Am I max headroom-ish?
You're good.
Yeah. So Des, I think if we're looking left of boom, the idea here is to get concise documentation in place follows much of the things that we brought up here. And then to Tim's point, you have all of the contingencies, especially the ones that are likely to occur. And then you've talked through, whether it's a tabletop or other simulation where you've exercised that plan and show evidence and things like an after action report or lessons learned. That gives that full life cycle of evidence that shows that you have a plan, you tested the plan, you found gaps, you made the plan better, right? Bad stuff's going to happen. We can't prevent that, but how do we respond and recover and get things back to normal? And that's where the after action report lessons learned can go a long way. Then insurance companies and others can say, hey, Tim and company, they might have some documentation gaps and things, but they did everything they could in their power to prepare for a bad day. They had a bad day, or from an audit perspective, it's not exactly what we need, but that's going to be a minor nonconformity or something else that needs fixed to make your program better, which is that continuous improvement focus.
All right, I just have to say this, and I'm bringing it up here. Like, I love that you said AAR. Like, you totally brought me back to 1990, whatever it was. And I'm like, oh, my Army days, and after action review. Like, oh, I love the fact that you used that word. Sorry, I just had to chime in. Like, win. Because I don't think we do that enough in the space, as being able to look at something and do an after action review. Some might call it a root cause analysis, an RCA maybe, but I love that you mentioned that. You just made my little goosebumps. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was
Mr.
enjoying
Seymour. Oh, sorry, Des. Go ahead.
That's okay. That's all good. I like the proactive part. And like, for when I think about proactiveness and the importance of it, as always, I just like to bring it down to what affects my life. And I think about when you break or lose your phone, and say 10 years ago, you break and lose your phone and everything's gone, no passwords, no nothing, and trying to reset all your passwords and find all your phone numbers and all of that information. And then it got a lot easier because most of your phone numbers are in the cloud and they move, and you still have those pictures that you had when you were 18 and I'm aging myself, but you kind of get what I mean. Going through that process when you don't have any sort of backup, where you don't have a password manager, it's a crazy amount of work and frustrating and stressful, and it's just resetting everything. And I'm saying this on like the most easy level, but if a disaster happens in your business, that stress that happens is spiked so much. But having a place where you can go to and say, if this happens, this is what I can do afterwards, and proactively doing that saves so much love, so much stress, so much effort, and can really help any business get to where they need to be sooner, faster, with less stress.
That's awesome. Brian, any thoughts about the insurance scenario?
Yeah, I think you guys said it nicely, so I'm not going to beat the horse on that. But I guess just speaking from the soul here, right? I like the word proactive. We need to be proactive when it comes to our policies. It blows my mind that we're not. I feel like every MSP here that's an owner, that's in a leadership position, has a responsibility to your staff, to your people, to put them in prepared. How could you ask somebody to deliver managed services and not have a plan for them as the business? I mean, isn't that what you're supposed to do as a business owner? Is create a plan for your people, protect your people, protect your stakeholders, protect data, protect everything. But it starts with your people. And to me, those plans, that policy, that procedure, that is I took the time to make sure that my team is prepared when they go in for battle. I mean, that's what this is when I boil it down. So it's about being proactive with your policies. The MSPs have built this entire business model over the last 2 decades by doing what? Being proactive. We all raised our hands and told our customers when they were paying us hourly and break fix and pro services that we could be better and more efficient by being proactive. That holds true with policies. We talked about left a boom, right a boom. all the way on the left of the boom, we have identify. All the way on the right of the boom, we got the recover. You don't want to be the person trying to build an SOP when you're over in the recover side. That's not the time to be building that. You should be doing it in the identify side. When you've identified the attack surface, when you've identified the digital assets, when you know what infrastructure looks like and all the other things that come with it, that's when you make your policy and have a plan for when something happens, not if. It's when something happens. And if you've been one of the fortunate MSPs to not have that happen, that just means you're just that much closer to it happening. So again, for me, it's just all about being prepared and protecting your people, protecting your business, protecting your customers, protecting revenue. I think all of that just fits into this. Be proactive with your policies. We have an obligation as MSPs to protect our customers, but also protect your staff. You don't want to make your staff look unprepared when an incident's going down and they're on the line for it, right? They're the ones managing the customers. So I'm so passionate about give your people a chance to win when things don't look right. You guys have spent years and decades building your reputation, and it can take a moment to ruin all of it by not being prepared with a simple document. So
yeah, and just something real quick too, because Des talked about proactive and prepared, but we as MSPs, we started primarily as engineers, and most MSPs, you are over engineering your plans. Okay, especially when we talk about resiliency plans, we always go to the Mac Daddy ransomware gigantic event without building any muscle memory or getting people used to a way when the disaster happens on how to respond. Okay. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. We've all heard that, right? And let me tell you, when an incident or bad things happen, you get punched in the face and it's chaos. And if you have not gone through a tabletop and walked through the plan through the plan, and I would encourage you not to do it in steps 1 to done. Those playbooks, because they never fit the exact scenario, get thrown out the second the bad things happen, right? You get punched in the face, oh, the playbook, wait, this doesn't match our scenario, because you'll never match the scenario. Think of resiliency in terms of building blocks. Just like Legos get assembled, something bad happens, and I'm going to put the Recover AWS, availability zone Lego in place. I'm going to have the communications team Lego in place. And you start building these Legos instead of having this playbook that's over-engineered in steps 1 to done, because it gets thrown out in the midst of the chaos and being punched in the face.
Noah popped up and says LinkedIn user. I just want to acknowledge Chris White's comment here. Like having a playbook, but you don't practice it. Oh, and wait a minute. Speaking of playbook, did you know we were going to get into this, Chris? Anyways, we'll get to that in a minute, but I just wanted to pop up Chris's thing here. There was a question that came in chat from Frederick. And Brian, I love how you answer this, because this comes up a lot, right? How should policies and when and often? So I'll give you a second to read it here.
Yeah, I think I did earlier. Okay, got it here. How often should policies be reviewed or audited? Okay, let me unpack that though a little bit, because there's more than one question there. Policies have to be reviewed at least annually. Okay, otherwise they're considered abandoned. So if you don't have a change log that shows that someone has reviewed that and update the change log for the policy within a year, it's considered abandoned. So at least annually. Even CMMC 800-171 says periodically means at least annually. Okay, now you're always monitoring your policies for policy exceptions. Nothing bothers an auditor more than you saying, oh, this is the way we do it, or except for when we don't, right? It's like, well, wait a second, what is this? So monitor your policies for policy exceptions. Am I frozen again? Monitor your policy for policy exceptions. A great policy has less than 5% policy exceptions, right? So if you say you're going to have multi-factor authentication on all your stuff, you want to have less than 5% policy exceptions on that, but you're touching it at least every year. And then if there's any significant changes in the organization, any significant structure things or a new framework or a client requirement, that's where a policy oftentimes has to be updated, but touch them at least once a year.
I love that. And, you know, it's funny, a little anecdotal, because you know how much I love to like go off the rails. You know, I was talking with an MSP 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 months ago, and, you know, they had their HR prospect on there in their HR team. And I just asked the HR person, and I said, when was the last time you updated your employee handbook? And they kind of went silent for a minute. And then they came back with, I don't know, probably like 14 years ago when we started the company. I said, okay, let me ask you another question. During COVID, did all your staff work from home? Absolutely. Did you like update the policy to say that they could be allowed and what that would look like to work from home? Oh, and the light bulb went off. And then I asked, how come you don't actually review it? Well, we don't think about it. We're not reminded. It isn't something that just we have on a to-do or a plan or a schedule or a thing that like Brian, you mentioned this earlier. You don't want them to become shelfware. And there's lots of different ways, lots of different tools. Heck, you know, just put a calendar date, like whatever, however you do that. But the idea of a policy becoming abandoned because you forgot, you didn't have time, you actually didn't have a reminder to review it regularly. You know, the interesting component about NIST, you know, we kind of standardized 853, blah, blah, blah. It always had in brackets, company defined, which really doesn't mean anything other than we need to define that. And so we had a policy on policy. And in that policy on policy, it said we would at least annually review documents and then set the calendars and the reminders and the things accordingly so that they did not become 14 years later and we've never looked at the employee handbook.
There's a fantastic question. Thank you so much, Emily, for throwing that in. We do have 8 minutes, so I am going to add this question as my final thoughts, because I do think it is really important that the idea, how do you make policies not shelfware? How specific or not specific? So to Emily's question, they are internally discussing how or how not specific to be with policies. Do you include things like names and details, or do you keep them completely useless? I don't know if they're useless. We're going to answer the question. Uselessly vague. Brian?
Yeah, so this is a question you get a lot, is what's the Goldilocks? We talked about that at the beginning, Goldilocks, not too much and not too that. Policies, very seldom would a quality policy have proper nouns in it, where you would say a specific tool name. It'd be very unusual. Procedures, that's the place where you bifurcate those. Policies, high level, stands the test of time, right? We will have a tool in place that does this, this, and that, but you don't list the tool name, not in policies. Again, they're very high level. You wouldn't just say, hey, we want to protect everything, right? That's too vague, but you would want to go through and list some of the, not the proper nouns, but maybe the type of technology that would support that. Words like MFA, words like segmentation, you know, separation of duties, things like that in there, but without listing the actual tool name. The tool name can go in the procedure, right? Where you say using this. Something else we didn't talk a lot about, but it's important. I'll just leave the nugget with on procedures, is the idea with procedures is that they are to the level of detail where someone skillful in the art of performing the task can do. Okay, so if you're new to writing procedures, don't try to start with writing some gigantic one, right? Be brilliant at the basics. Get really good at writing a procedure that your kids can follow to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Try that, write that procedure, right? Here's how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then have them follow it, right? Or here's how to brush your teeth, right? Those sound simple, but when you start writing a procedure that someone else has to follow, you start to really understand what level of detail do I need for
Yes.
someone that is skillful in the art of performing the task. And I stole that definition out of the CMMC assessment guide as far as writing procedures, as far as someone skillful in the art of performing the task. But I think it's a good one.
Yeah, I love, because I hear this in our peer group every single week. Like, I have a 7,000 100 trillion billion step process for brushing my teeth. Like, what? I love the fact that you need to be able to boil it down to who is the audience intended to read this thing and make sure it's written to them.
Yeah, and to Tim's point, you don't need to know how the toothpaste is made, right? Or the container specifications for the toothpaste or the bristles requirements on the toothbrush, right? It's probably not that level of detail. So good stuff.
So with that, we are about 4 minutes out. My favorite thing has been, and I would recommend to anyone watching, what Brian said about the making it so you're teaching a toddler to make a PB&J sandwich. If you watch some videos on reading directions for how to make and there's people who do videos where it is very entertaining, because if your brain thinks differently and you read directions, if you don't write open jar, then you never open the jar. If you don't write use the knife one way, then you never use that. You can use the knife however you want. And I think it's super entertaining to watch. So that would be mine. Tim, any final thoughts?
Yeah, we didn't get to this, and it's fine that we didn't get to this, but I will drop the link in chat. Building out a policy program, a procedure program, there are some pretty easy to follow guides to help you. We have one on the website. I'll drop the link over there. I would say biggest takeaway from today is make sure you have the right stakeholders in the conversation at the right time, and make sure that you empower your team and give them time to do the work and give them the why behind the work, right? If we're going to develop policies, procedures, standards, documentation, left of boom, get prepared, do all the things, make sure as the business leader in your MSP that you give your staff the time to do the work.
Ryan, any final takeaways?
Yeah, I would say, again, be proactive. Don't wait. Don't wait around for an incident or a prospect or a customer to come asking for something that you don't have. Get in front of this stuff now. I think it's one of the number one things that can impact you guys is being prepared. And to Brian's point, when you start to actually write your policies, I agree, policies should be general and we shouldn't be very specific so that the policy is one to many. And then in the SOP is where we're going to really define some of those specifics, right? That's what the SOP is about, the specifics and how we're going to do it. But to Brian's point, if you go through that process of documenting how to do things, you will become an expert in that thing. I know that as I have had to write guides and how-tos, I come to realize like it actually teaches me that I know what I'm talking about. If you can write a step-by-step guide for something, then you've truly mastered that subject and you're skillful in that art, as Brian so elegantly put it. So those would be my takeaways for you guys. Get your documentation done.
Brian?
Yeah, good stuff all the way around. I would think, don't just copy pasta. Okay, you'll be tempted to because a client comes to you or you have to do something quickly to show you have policies in place, right? Quick and dirty lives long past the quick. So what you're doing is creating more risk for yourself. Okay, so if you are challenged with having to write policies, be clear, concise, involve others, right? We talked about getting the buy-in, especially stakeholders that will have to pay for the controls and procedures that get put in place to support the policies. I froze again, didn't I? So I think at the end of the day, that's where policies and procedures are effective. is that they're clear, concise, we have controls in place, and if someone asks, or better yet, we want to mature as an organization, right? We have evidence and artifacts to support the controls are operational and effective because they're supporting the policy and leadership intent all the way back to the business.
Perfect.
Great.
Excellent. I'm going to do quick 2 seconds to wrap this up. So as Tim mentioned, we did downloads, or there is some links, some content here. We talked a lot about a ton of information, and I'm guaranteeing you probably only remember about 10%, 5% by tomorrow. We're fantastic. We're amazing, but we do have content for you to download. Please take a minute to download this information. We really want to work with you. We want to help you out. If you have any other questions, connect with any of us, LinkedIn, social. I would say my phone number out loud here, but I feel like that's a bad idea. But please reach out. We'd love to connect with you and have any other questions. And we will be doing these quite often. So the next I'm good with episode. The next episode of the amazing Tim, Brian, Des, and Ryan show is March 20th. So please take a second to register for that. We'll throw the link in there. And then thank you so much for watching us, entertaining with us, engaging with us, asking questions, all of those fun things. And thank you as well, gentlemen, for joining me today. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Awesome. Thanks, Des.
Thanks all. Thanks, everybody.
Subscribe now.